Okay. Hey, KK.
Hi, Venkat.
Hey. Yes, looks like a good background that you have there. Uh,
I'm actually joining you from your own hometown, Boston, and this is a venue called Cyclorama.
cool. Okay. Last time, I think we left talking about the problems in vulnerability space with respect to prioritization and the problems with respect to just using the CVSS scores, just using the EPSS scores is not good enough for prioritization because, to summarize from last call, more than half of the CVSS scores are critical and high in terms of CAS scores. A very small percentage of CVEs are covered by EPSS and so forth. So we need a different way to prioritize the vulnerabilities. And then we are showing glimpse of uh, how AI can help. What is the gaps in terms of the data collection? What are the fields that are needed for analysis, and so on and so forth, and how AI can help there. I think that's where we left last time.
Yeah, and a couple of other points as well, right? In addition to that, which is that the CV database itself is running behind by about 25,000 vulnerabilities still to be updated, and that lag continues as the number of submissions increase and with staffing cuts in CISA and NVD and other organizations, right? And then also that even if we had a perfectly updated CV database and we had all the threat intel added into it, which is what we built at Transilience, it would still lack the organizational context. So bringing that in, the asset criticality, the network architecture, the exposure of the asset, the nature of the asset, all of that I think matters a lot when we sit down to prioritize vulnerabilities. So maybe we take a look at the platform that we built and how that addresses some of these challenges.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you bring up a good point with respect to the NVD and CISA problems. I think last week NVD moved about 25,000 vulnerabilities into a new category called deferred state. Nobody knows what it means. It used
Hmm.
to be, awaiting analysis. Now it's deferred. Nobody knows whether deferred means they won't do the analysis or it's a state where CV is going to a graveyard. And also, CISA has multiple issues with respect to the people getting laid off and job cuts and so on and so forth. So that is already a real problem there. Okay, let
Yeah.
me share on what um, might be a way towards a good problem with respect to vulnerability prioritization. This is a decision tree from SSVC from CISA, which I think some of the forward-looking vulnerability organizations are starting to adopt
Hmm.
with various states um, of vulnerability prioritizations. This can be how many number of ways. For example, if I look at the patching prioritization and cycle with respect to patching cycle, etc., there is multiple organizations. I think maybe 90% of the organizations have a patch cycle, whether it's monthly patching, quarterly patching, etc. And usually the hope is that the there are the medium categorized vulnerabilities. If you can categorize them right, the medium categorized vulnerabilities are usually taken care of by the patching cycle. And since usually the medium SLA is 90 days, if you're patching within 90 days, you don't need to do anything, and the mid-level vulnerabilities will be taken care of. And there is a tail end of vulnerabilities that are informational, usually 180 days, 360 days, and so forth, that yeah, you can somehow wait out, so to speak, meaning either the developer teams will upgrade to a major version, and therefore this vulnerabilities will go away, etc. So much of the burden falls in the top two categories here, which is what are the vulnerabilities that I need to take care of now before the patching cycle happens? What are the vulnerabilities that I need to tap on the shoulders of the development team to stop their sprints, to stop their feature development, and ask them to fix? What are the patching items that I need to ask the infrastructure team to go and fix right now? What are the things that I need to go inform my FedRAMP team or my government agency and my stakeholder or my CISO that, hey, here's the vulnerabilities that you're seeing in the news that we are taking care of. So the point is to get to what is the top two buckets, so to speak, of vulnerabilities I need to dig deep into, and that is where I think the devil is in the details of, back to, you cannot use just the CVSS scores or EPSS scores. So what should go into the decision tree here? And SSVC here does a good job. You can look it up. It's the SSVC decision tree. I think I have it open here. I hope. And this is the document from SSVC, CISA SSVC categorization guide, and it takes into account multiple stakeholders to be able to arrive at a decision. And they have the notion called partial and automatic, and it goes. We can read through the document for people who are listening to this call. They have a similar decision tree here, which you can optimize and change. What at Transilience, what we have, our point of view is that there are four or so categories, with the top two categories that you want to focus on, and the mid category is taken care of by the patch. But the automatability of the exploit is what the SSVC tree focuses on. Automatability means that there is no friction in terms of the exploitability of the CVE, and the impact of the asset is very, very high. Meaning there is no ifs and buts. If the asset is impacted, it's a huge business impact there. There are multiple ways that you can define the automatability aspect of it, of an exploit. For example, you can define your automatability as the exploit is exploitable over the network. There is no attack complexity, meaning for you to do the attack, there is no, from attacker's perspective, there is no knowledge required. I can just download an exploit out there and run it. So that goes back to that there is an active exploit and exploit code that I don't need to change. The user interaction is none. So any attacker from anywhere can conduct the exploit without further logging in and so forth. The privileges required are none. So you can define the automatability of the exploit in your own terms with respect to what's risky for our business. But in general, it is quite critical for people to understand the automatability of the exploit, the automatability of the impact of the exploit before you can prioritize, is our thinking.
So Venkat, to just interrupt you here, we also discussed that EPSS is not a fully reliable metric. So how are we gathering the exploitability, the availability of the exploit, and how automatable, what do you say? Automatable is that exploit? So where is that intel coming in from?
Right. So that is a good question. Let me share my screen again. If you take a look at any vulnerability, and this is an SSH exploit that from last year, I think, and which is rated as high. And of course, the usual vectors, our attack vector is network, complexity is a little bit high, but the details with regards to whether the exploit is available or not is not here. The complexity might be high, but if somebody has a exploit out there that I can run, then that doesn't matter. So there is the high level details here that NVIDIA has filled out. And if you look at the links here, you can see about 70 or 80 links here, from vendors to researchers to there's GitHub issues from various vendors. You can see GitHub issues of GitHub code of PowerShell, of the exploit code itself. You can probably also see some exploit code that is coming out of Twitter and so on and so forth. There's also links from the publishers of the exploit itself and researchers who have researched the exploit enough to understand how it works. There's a lot of good information in the links that are attached here. You don't need to even search the internet, etc. With regards to how the exploit works, what is the complexity required, what are the dependencies, whether the code is reachable or not. If you go and look at the GitHub issues, you can understand, for example, say that code is not reachable, or this attacker would need a lot of details with regards to how the configuration works before I can exploit. The automatability of the exploit is if somebody can read through all the links here, they should be able to get to the understanding of how automatable the exploit is, and that's what vulnerability engineers are painfully tasked to do these days. Whenever there is an exploit that their CISO says, "Hey, should we patch this right away?" Or when a development team says, "Why should I patch this?" They'll go through all the links on the NVD and on the internet, and they will research all these things to figure out whether it's really critical or not.
And so if we were to go on Transilience, we've already done all of that, right? So you can use natural language querying to ask all of these questions instead of reading these 20 links, 40 links, and figuring out what's what.
Right. Yeah,
so
the good thing about...
see this...
Go ahead.
I was just saying, if we could see the same vulnerability on Transilience and query it, we could maybe see what's the kind of intel we're bringing in, right?
Right. Yeah, the good thing about LLMs is just like a human can read through a bunch of text and can understand the text and can make judgment calls regarding the text, whether something is critical or not. LLMs are very good at, that's their bread and butter. They're pretty good at understanding large amounts of text and determine whether something is critical or not, and answer users' questions regarding the text. I mean, I think most of us are familiar with uploading PDFs into ChatGPT or whatever, and then ask questions on it. Similarly, if you can upload all these links and documents into a ChatGPT or a NotebookLM and ask questions regarding, hey, this is my environment, how critical is, etc. And that's essentially the gist of how LLMs can help with prioritization. So instead of the engineers going and downloading those links and converting them to PDFs, etc., our agents, Transilience agents, they are trained to go into each of the links, read through the documents, understand what it's saying, answer a list of 70 different questions, and present them in such a way that it is easy for users to understand and prioritize. So let me maybe share again to take a look at how our the same vulnerability. If you look at the Transilience app, how that will look like. So it's the same vulnerability, the SSH vulnerability, and the done Transilience analysis there, and you can see all the questions that a vulnerability engineer needs to research and answer to the CISO, the development teams, are these questions. Is there an upgrade path? Is there a compensating control or workaround? What is the latest of that particular software version? Should I upgrade to latest or minor? So all the questions that I need to answer to development teams and my CISO. And if I look at, for example, a simple workaround, are there workarounds, for example? there is a workaround for this particular vulnerability, and it's not just how do you do the what's the workaround? Go and change some configuration. How do you change the configuration? Which file? This is the file. How do you actually do it? Right. So you open the file and you change this and do that. And is that it? No, you have to restart the SSH to be able to for it to be able to pick up the configuration. So there are all these little details that are very, very important for you to tell the development team. And even little things like restart SSHD matters a lot. A lot of times we see that, hey, a vulnerability is patched, but it's showing up, and it's because a kernel has not been restarted, SSHD has not been restarted. So what you see here happening is the LLM reading through the vulnerability details in all the links and gathering all the details and organizing them in such a way that the vulnerability engineer doesn't need to go research, but they can make a decision with regards to whether this is doable or not.
And Venkat, I think there is this, since we are talking about SSH vulnerabilities, we also always want to see the reachability of port 22, especially if it's protected by a firewall, or if it's an internal server which I have further segmented off that port 22 access to only specific IP addresses. So when we submit a vulnerability report to a customer, we use the base CVSS score, right? Not the temporal CVSS score, because we don't want to bother with taking into account all the organizational environment. But with Transillions, that becomes very simple to do, right? So the same vulnerability can be rescored in a matter of seconds by simply putting in that query. I think that's one of the pre-built queries as well, right? If
Right.
this SSH is protected behind a firewall, rescore this vulnerability.
Right. Yeah,
And
and
obviously we can, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a question with regards to what parameters are important for vulnerability prioritization, and if it is that easy, right, we wouldn't be doing the webinars. So there's a lot of parameters and a lot of curiously. Yeah, it's a job security for vulnerability engineers because there's no one formula, so to speak. It's a judgment call with respect to looking at. I'll show the parameters that we collect, but we collect about 70 different parameters of a vulnerability, and we create a decision tree based on all the parameters of all the vulnerabilities and outcomes prioritization. Therefore, good news is that it's a complex task, and vulnerability engineers, I think, will still have our jobs, but it's a tedious task. I mean, I don't wish upon vulnerability engineer being a vulnerability engineer on anybody because it's a tedious task. And to go back to your question or the topic of do I have a firewall? How does it matter in terms of temporal scopes, etc.? And that is one of the big parameters. So not only that the questions that you have on the vulnerability are important, but taking into consideration your environment is also important. Whether you have firewall rules or WAF rules to block the vulnerability, you can change the severity of the vulnerability from a critical to a medium. For example, if you know that you have a WAF blocking the particular exploit, or you have a firewall rule blocking the exploit, or even sometimes if the asset itself is not critical at all and it's out of scope with respect to the complaints or with respect to criticality of the impact of the exploit, you can downgrade the vulnerability. And it's not that easy because the auditors and compliance people got smart as well with regards to how you determined that a critical vulnerability got into medium. So you have to go and ask. They will usually ask a report of show me the rescoring, and using CVSS3 or CVSS4 rescoring, you need to prove that this is the reason why I downgraded it to a critical to a medium. And good news is that LLMs there can help as well with regards to if you can feed the formula for scoring a vulnerability, which we did, then LLMs would be able to understand the vulnerability, plug in the right variables, and rescore, which Transillions did here. So I said rescore this vulnerability. and 8 point something vulnerability came to 6.0 to a medium security level because of the rescoring, and this is the rescoring mechanism that you can submit to an auditor.
Yeah, precisely, and this would have taken a huge amount of effort if we have to do it across 50, 60, 70,000, 100,000 vulnerabilities, which is a typical scale for even a mid-sized organization at any given point in time. In the comments, Dhruv has a question like, what all parameters do you take into account for prioritization? I think you answered some, but if we can give a more kind of comprehensive answer to that.
Yeah, so there are even understanding the parameters would be helpful. Let me. We have our agents collect a lot of information, as I said, about 70 or so parameters. We have Transilience as an API for you to get all those parameters, and it's public. So you can go to transilience.ai and then click on the API. You can give your email and get an API key and query our API. So if you look at the parameters, we organize the parameters multiple ways. Just these impact parameters, the CIA, there are about, as I said, 70 or 80 different parameters. And usually, if you look at just integrity or availability, dig deep into those two, there is usually whether there's availability problem, and it's not that cut and easy, because is the application totally crashing, or is it eating CPU, or is it memory? That if you convert that into dollar amount, if the total application is crashed, that means no users can access the application. There is that 100%. If the application is less performant, then maybe 50% of the users can access. That's a different dollar amount. Integrity, for example, if you can modify application data, that's a customer specific impact. If the exploit can modify the execution logic, that means that the attacker can actually inject any code that they want inside the application execution logic, and they can get a shell. And depending on the process, they can get a root shell. So you need to understand each and every line here with respect to whether the exploit is able to read application data, write application data, read memory or write memory, or total application crash versus not, to be able to really understand the impact of the vulnerability. And that is just on the impact side. And there is exploit metrics and there is threat metrics with regards to whether the POC is available, whether whatever the attacker needs in terms of the access before they can exploit. There are a lot of parameters, and this is available over the API, so you can hook up your own custom formula and then put it in a CI/CD pipeline and say, these are the 2 or 3 parameters that I care about, or the business cares about, and I'll pass I'll make an API call to Transilience, and I'll pass the build if those two parameters pass, so to speak. So check out the parameters and all the parameters, and maybe read through and understand which parameters are important to your business.
And Venkat, how are our current? We have customers on Transilience, so how are some of those customers using the API today?
Yeah, so we have customers who have software in their SBOMs. For example, here's my list of software, and they make an API call to us with just software. I have SSH and this version, and we will tell them over the API whether that particular software is good or bad. And if it is bad, go and upgrade, and here's why. So with a simple API call, it's pretty powerful. With the alternative of you installing agents, getting the CVEs, understanding the CVEs, understanding all the parameters, prioritization, it bypasses pretty much all that work. Just make an API call with the software list and get all the parameters and decide for yourself whether it is important to you, or you can make or you can hire TransIlium, so to speak, to do all that work for you, even prioritization work, so that you don't have to do any work in terms of prioritization.
Right. Those who've joined us, if you have any comments or questions in the chat, please send those across. We'll be happy to answer them.
Let's wait for a couple of minutes for the comments here. Yeah, the problem I think will become more and more complex to solve because of AI and coding and so forth, where there are a lot of the number of libraries are growing up, and the automatic pulling of libraries. If you're doing white coding, for example, all the developers without any hesitation, they're just pulling in all the libraries they want into the code without understanding them. So the number of software packages that people are going to use is going to grow exponentially with white coding. So I think that the prioritization problem as it exists today, the pain will grow exponentially with AI being used to develop software.
So Venkat, before we, if you get more any questions, we'll answer them. But before we wrap up, I had a question that, I went to ChatGPT and I asked it to generate a report of the latest Fortinet vulnerabilities, and it completely hallucinated the output. Okay, it just came up with random Fortinet CV numbers which don't exist. That's crazy because somebody could have relied on that to send it up to management or whatever, right? With all the news around Fortinet exploitable vulnerabilities. In fact, we had advisories come in directly for our own infrastructure as well. So how are we making sure that TransIliance is not hallucinating? How are you addressing the hallucination issue?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think that's pretty much all the professionals and business people who are using general purpose GPTs, general purpose foundational models, which are trained on the internet. Their brain is the internet. Need to be careful about, meaning that everything that's been said on the internet is in the brain of the foundational models. So you never know, and you can't control which part of the weights and that will get triggered when you ask a question. Sometimes the brain might go to a Stack Overflow that somebody has asked, and sometimes it might go to some other legit answer. So it's important to not rely on the big brain that the foundation model has, but give it specific data to the foundational model. Along with the big brain that it has, you need to give specific context to the model and say, use this context before you answer the vulnerability. And that's what we do. We use the foundational models, and everybody does, but our agents, as I said, collect all the data from all the links, and we vet them. And when we ask the question of whether it's vulnerable or not, we give that big data that we have collected along with the general purpose training that it has, and say, answer the question based on just this data that I'm going to give you, not the training. And that will help the model to only look at the data that we're providing and not look at the training that it has. I think Aman.
We can take that last question and then we can close the session. Yeah. Go ahead. You take it.
So you want to take that, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty trivial. Integrating with any security technology is simply an API call. So when we talk about vulnerability correlation, right, where we want to correlate the alert with whether it's exploiting a known vulnerability in that asset, that's very beautifully done with TransIliance. So we can actually escalate that issue's severity level based on the fact that it's exploiting a known issue in an asset that the customer has. So that's an easy correlation, integration and correlation rule to build.
Yep. Cool. So we can leave it at that for this session.
All right. look forward to the
Alright.
next one. We'll go deeper into maybe TransAlliance architecture and use cases and some sample outputs.
All right. See you there. Bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye. Thanks, Uncle.
Thanks.